Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Jonathan Fritz. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for Chime. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's Chime Innovation Beyond the Edge. We're nearing the end of our second season, with this being our 21st Innovation Beyond the Edge. We've heard from great thought leaders, including Heather Nelson, John Halamka, Ryan Smith, Dan Barchi, Sarah Vaezi, Tanya Townsend, Mark Probst, Sarah Richardson, Shafiq Rob, and many others. All of those sessions are available on demand through the Chime website. Innovation Beyond the Edge is designed to share creative problem solving and highlight innovation successes implemented by your peers. Today, I'm very excited to hear from a great thought leader and friend, Scott Powder, the Chief Strategy Officer at Advocate Aurora Health. He's going to speak about dual transformation, an innovation strategy used by many forward-thinking organizations outside and including healthcare. We'll be taking a break for the holidays and be back in January with more Innovation Beyond the Edge programs. But if you're listening live or on demand and you'd like to present one of these sessions, please reach out to me directly. A special thank you to our seasoned supporters, ClearSense and Nordic. And I'd like to thank Bill Carter and our partner CITI for supporting today's session. We know that you're incredibly busy, and so we appreciate you joining us today. So quickly, why is Chime presenting this series? Quite frankly, change presents challenges and problems, but it also presents opportunity for creative problem solving. We want to highlight creative problem solving and innovation successes and share them with the Chime community. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Bill Carter, the Healthcare Practice Regional Director of Sales for CITI, to introduce our speaker for today. Bill?
Well, good morning, everyone. I am Bill Carter, and I'm a Regional Director within the Healthcare Practice for Creative Information Technology Incorporated, or CITI. We're really proud to sponsor today's Chime Innovation Beyond the Edge session, the challenge of dual transformation with Mr. Scott Powder. CITI is also helping health systems transform and be more efficient and financially prudent by better managing legacy information systems data via our data retention and interoperability data archiving solution, by providing data analytics via our data insights platform, and by transforming data for interoperability via our Data Connect integration engine. We're also helping manage patient and provider communications via our Patient Buddy and Recover applications. Citi also provides a host of services for health systems for managing legacy information systems, migrating data to new EHRs and EMRs, managing accounts receivables, providing technical and business advisory services, and providing staff augmentation. This morning, it is my sincere privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Scott Powder. Scott is recognized as a national thought leader and has served at Advocate Aurora for 27 years. He has held positions in business development and strategy, including the Vice President of Business Development for Lutheran General Hospital, the VP of Business Development for Advocate Medical Group, and the VP of System Strategy and Development before serving in his current role as the Senior VP and Chief Strategy Officer. Scott serves as a board member for several of the organizations within the Advocate Aurora Health portfolio. He works with several venture capital funds, and he serves wonderfully within his community in metropolitan Chicago. Good morning, Scott. We all look forward to your presentation today. Enjoy. Thank you.
Bill, thanks. And good morning, everyone. So I'm delighted to be here and speak a little bit about dual transformation and hopefully have some further discussion. I did put together a few slides just to sort of provide some visual cues. So I'm going to try to share my screen and let's see what happens if I do this right. I'm looking at Jonathan. Give me the thumbs up that you're seeing it. Yay. Okay. So let me again thank Bill for sponsoring and for the introduction, Jonathan for asking me to do this. I've known Jonathan for several years now, probably 4 or 5 years, and we've intersected in a variety of venues that seem to revolve around technology and innovation, and got a lot of respect for him and for what Chime is doing as an organization. So I will jump right in. As I was thinking about, and I'll spend a few minutes on what is dual transformation in a second, but I love the way Chime is framing innovation beyond the edge. And I almost thought of titling this Innovation Over the Edge. Like, this is not a strategy for the faint of heart. And I will say that it poses a set of unique challenges. And if you're not in an organization facing the specific challenges that I'll articulate in a second, I actually discourage people from this strategy, because it has a set of unique challenges, and you really have to have to actually implement it successfully. So you really have to have a set of conditions and circumstances that kind of force you into doing this strategy. And that's a little bit about what we've been facing at Advocate Aurora. So a brief comment about Advocate Aurora. I'm sort of guessing most of you know who we are, but we're one of the 10 largest health systems in the country. We are housed in Wisconsin and Illinois. That's where our operations are based. We serve about 3 million people, unique individuals in a typical year. And I'd say the thing that's most unique about us is, we're, of the 3 million people that we serve, almost 50% are served through a value-based contract. And of that, another 50% of that 50% are served in a contract with which we have significant, if not 100% downside financial risk through capitation or other reimbursement mechanisms. So we're on the hook financially for 600,000 or 700,000 lives in terms of the total cost of care, which is in effect makes us the third largest insurance company in the state of Illinois, and the second largest in the state of Wisconsin. Now, we don't have an insurance license, so we are simply taking downstream risk from the insurance carriers themselves or from Medicare. So that causes us to think a little bit differently. We are definitely not a pure fee-for-service engine. We're very much about value-based care, and some of the innovation that we pursue is in response to having that much financial risk on our income statement and balance sheet. So let me attempt to move this thing. There we go. Okay. So, yep, there we go. We're moving now. Okay. So here's the situation in a nutshell. And I should say Advocate Aurora was formed a little over 2.5 years ago now. It's the merger of Advocate and Aurora, and we did the classic innovative, creative naming and just call it Advocate Aurora. But around that time, so in 2018, we did our first strategic plan, and I led that work with our executive team and our board, and we were kind of looking at, okay, why did we merge and what are the conditions that we're facing? And the most important one is the first one. We felt that the underlying conditions in healthcare delivery are such that almost no matter what we do, we're very likely going to have permanent declines in our profitability. And if you, again, this is the condition which I would say, if you don't have that and you're in one of those markets where perhaps you have a more fragmented payer environment and you have a stronger position in the market, and you're not facing rising costs that are exceeding the revenue growth that you're achieving, don't even talk about this strategy. But if you're like us and you realize that underlying utilization of most of our services, particularly inpatient, which is 35 to 40% of our revenue, is inevitably going down, and where we make our money in outpatient is probably over time going to face massive pricing pressure and competition, our ability to kind of generate revenue that exceeds the underlying cost increases is essentially very limited at best. And for the last 4 or 5 years, both of the legacy organizations have been in that sort of scenario where costs were outpacing revenue growth, and we don't think, despite intervention, that it will moderate, but it won't mitigate that decline. That's sort of you have to believe that about your situation in order to really want to look at something like dual transformation. So the conclusion from all of this was, hey, we got to transform our core business. You can't rely, you can't just let it die. That's our core mission, is serving, is care delivery, but we need to look at some new ways of generating growth and profitability. So that's the basic premise of dual transformation, is doing two things at once, which is the exact opposite. If you ever read Michael Porter, who's sort of one of the, original thought leaders on strategy, he always said, focus and do one thing really well and be great at it. This is basically saying you got to do two things at the same time. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do, because oftentimes those things are at odds with each other and require you to sort of take resources from one to fund the other. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So this is the basic framework of dual transformation, and I will give complete credit to a firm called Oversight, which was founded by Clay Christensen, who recently passed away, but is sort of one of the fathers of disruptive innovation. And he was a Harvard business professor, and he basically, coined the concept of disruptive innovation and wrote a whole bunch of really good books, all of which I encourage. And then, because got so many requests for, help to deploy these, this whole concept, he ultimately founded a firm called Oversight, and they wrote a book called Dual Transformation, which is a really good book, and it's pretty short. So I'm giving them props for all of this, but the concept is very simple. There's sort of three aspects to dual transformation. There's transformation A, which is how do you transform your core business? What do you do to, again, try to maybe regain or at least slow the erosion of profitability? Transformation B is really that new sources of growth and profitability. And the idea of C is the capabilities, like how do you take advantage of the capabilities you might have in your core business and leverage those to be successful in this new arena. And that's sort of that C part is actually the kind of the secret sauce, because one way you can certainly get into B is simply create be a startup, start a new company. And that's what a lot of startups are today, is venture funded or private equity funded in the B space, doing something different and new. What in theory incumbents like Advocate Aurora and probably many of your organizations have is a set of assets and capabilities and strengths that, if you can figure out how to take advantage of those specific and select strengths, that gives you in theory an unfair competitive advantage in the B space. The best example, very quickly, is actually outside of healthcare, and it's in entertainment, and it's Netflix. Their original business was simply mail order videos, and ultimately the business model that put Blockbuster out of business was the ability to stream video on demand. And so but the reality is that's their A business. That's their core, is streaming content. And over time, they started facing, when they were the only game in town, they had a great business model, but there's a million streaming services now. And so they realized that they needed that core business of streaming content was actually vulnerable. And so they created their B is content, and creating content, which of course now is also being replicated by many others. But at the time, they were the first to sort of become a content generator, and at one point had more Emmys than any of the legacy networks. The thing that their capabilities link is the data and information they have, because they were a digital streaming service. They had more data on user viewing preferences and than really anybody else, certainly more than the traditional analog networks had. They were able to use that to better predict the content that would actually get viewership. And so that allowed them to fundamentally change their business model from the traditional network television. They sign up 20 pilots and they hope one is successful. And they typically will only book talent for 3 or 4 episodes. Netflix is so good at predicting the success of their content because of all this digital information they have on their users. They were actually able to, they didn't do pilots, and they were able to book talent and commit to 2 or 3 years, which is what you need if you're in, if you're in on the talent side. Getting a contract for a year or 2 years is a lot better than a 3-episode pilot. So they fundamentally changed their business model. And again, for a long time, we're sort of, that was their B. So the question is, what's the B for a healthcare organization like Advocate Aurora? And so I'll spend a minute on that. This is sort of restating the same thing that I just said before, which is, if red is sort of your long-term trajectory, or at least what you believe your long-term profit trajectory is, the gap between the red and the blue is sort of your transformation A, but that blue still doesn't get you back to a sustainable profitability level to reinvest in the business. So the green is really the B. And in theory, and again, you could debate the magnitude, order of magnitude on A versus B, but conceptually this is the concept. So our strategy, which we call Transformation 2025, is really moving from being a care delivery organization to becoming a destination health company. Our purpose is we help people live well. So we very deliberately, when we created Advocate Aurora, both legacy organizations were called Advocate Healthcare, Aurora Healthcare. We took the word care out and just called it Advocate Aurora Health. And then we said our purpose is helping people live well. We are certainly in the business of curing illness, or at least managing illness, and what I would call the traditional care delivery. But we've also said our broader purpose is to help people live well. So our B is that right side of this chart, that concept of whole person health, which is a strategy that I lead, and I will go a little bit deeper on that. Really the stuff on the left, transforming our core, is what you would see on the agenda of almost every health system in the country right now. Improving our safety, our health outcomes, making sure we continue to grow, which has been an interesting challenge during COVID, obviously, and improving our cost position, our productivity, and becoming much more consumer focused. But to be honest with you, we can do all that stuff, and we would be very much like Blockbuster, who worked hard on their cost position, and they did a much better job of being consumer oriented, and yet they still were rendered obsolescent, or obsolete, if you will, by a totally different model. So that's where whole person health comes in. It's really becoming, our view is becoming a consumer health organization, not just a care delivery organization. So I want to go deeper on that. So whole person health, we've identified, again, our focus area is really, and this is new for us, we are not all that, we do not, I'd say of our almost 13 billion in revenue, 12 billion, 950 million of it comes from care delivery. And we have a very small piece of it that comes from what we would call consumer health and wellness services. So we have a small fitness division that, by the way, loses money. That's about the only thing that's sort of in this true, paid for by people out of pocket around health and wellness. Really everything else we do is paid for. While it may also be paid for by people somewhat out of pocket, that's as a function of their benefit design. So it's really funded through insurance coverage in some form or fashion. And we're saying we need to be in a different space where we're also taking care of people in areas where they're, where they're willing to pay out of pocket for these services. And we've identified 3 categories. Categories are very much like what you'd see in a consumer products company. So for us, aging independently is one category. Second is parenthood, and the third is personal performance. And over time, we envision some of these categories may change, some may drop. We may add categories as our business evolves. But we're starting with these 3, and we identified these back to that capabilities link. These are things where we have a set of competencies and capabilities in our core care delivery business that we think can be leveraged to give us some kind of advantage in competing in these spaces. The other is that these are all growth areas, and they're just fundamentally growing businesses, which is critical to, if we're going to enter and play in these spaces, we want there to be some underlying growth and good fundamentals. And again, these are also areas where people are paying out of their own pocket for various kinds of services. So that's how we're thinking about that whole person health, which is that this is our transformation. B is really becoming a consumer health and wellness company. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the underlying challenges of all this. And then again, certainly we'll open it up for questions. And if you want to go deeper on any of this, glad to do so. So here's the thing about dual transformation. You're in effect running one business, which is usually where most of the revenue and certainly cash flow is today. And you're trying to start up or acquire or build a set of businesses that are new and in the beginning are going to be losing money probably, or certainly, you know, going to be consuming capital to make acquisitions, which we envision most of our growth will come through acquisitions. So we're almost like an in-house private equity fund, for lack of a better description. And so the issue is you want to take advantage of those core capabilities, but what you don't want to do is have the core, we call it the sucking sound of the core. So that, you know, the reality is that, you know, care delivery is highly regulated. I suspect you all are a little bit like us. We're unbelievably bureaucratic, making decisions. While we've made some incredibly quick moves during COVID, our inherent speed of decision-making is generally slow. We have a lot of different parties that need to sign off on things. You know, the reality is we don't generate enough capital to fund all of our capital needs in the core. So getting access to capital and other resources is really hard. And we're in a low margin business. So it's not like we've got extra money just sort of laying around that we can spend. So doing something new is really hard when your core could consume all of your available resources and then some. So part of this is setting up some kind of separateness. And I will describe what we've done, but if you're not setting up separate resources, some kind of separate decision-making, and ideally waiving certain pieces of your policy and procedure compliance, you can't do this strategy. I just would say don't bother starting. Because again, you will just starve the new strategy and you'll just get frustrated and create you know, angst and tension between the core and the new stuff. That's inherent anyway, and balancing the resource allocation is really tricky. So if you're not going to make a commitment to having separate resources and some kind of separateness, it's just not worth doing the strategy. On the other hand, you also have to have connectedness. If you're not taking advantage of those core capabilities, then, you know, again, all you are is essentially a self-funded startup, and that's not necessarily that we don't have any ability to do anything different than any private equity or venture capital fund if we're not taking advantage of those core capabilities. And then the last thing I would say is, in terms of a challenge, is our governance. You know, we've got a board of very smart people. They come from corporate environments and from healthcare and other places, but they have grown up as governance of a large healthcare system, and they have relatively low tolerance for ambiguity and for risk outside of what's in the, you know, already in the core. And quite frankly, we have a massive infrastructure to manage ambiguity and risk in the core. So you have to have a board that's willing to, and I'll give you one small example. We've put together a 5-year financial plan, and the board wanted to know the companies we intend to buy 4 years from now. And I said, I just don't know. And they said, not only do they want to know the companies we're going to buy in 4 years, they want the 5-year ROI outlook on those companies. And I said, that's actually a higher standard than you even put on our hospital business. So you don't ask, we will tell you how much money we think we're going to spend in 4 or 5 years, but we can't earmark which projects, nor can we tell you what the ROI will be on them. But for some reason, because this is new and different, the board's actually asking for a higher level of certainty than they would ask in the core. So that's just a fascinating challenge. And again, you've got to have a board willing to live with, you're going to take some hits, you're going to have some losses, you're going to make some mistakes, even if you're going to buy a company or make an investment and it's going to, you know, not pan out. So you've got to have a long range outlook, which is part of the reason the board wanted to have know what companies we were going to buy in 4 years, and then what was the 5-year ROI on that. So they were trying to look 10 years out, but they were asking maybe the wrong question at that point in time. So those are some of the challenges. Briefly, here's how we've thought about, we do have separate oversight. We've created Advocate Aurora Enterprises, which is a separate division. I'm the president of Advocate Aurora Enterprises, and we have our own capital, we have our own operating budget, we have our own team. We've had waivers on a set of policies and procedures. For one small example, our purchasing and requisition. So we do not go through the traditional supply chain purchasing. It takes like 3 months to do vendor vetting because we have so many contracts in place. So we have outside counsel who does contracts for us whenever we need to stand up a vendor. And we've skinnied down the requirements for vendor vetting so that we can move quickly to bring vendors in to help us with whatever we're trying to do. So Advocate Aurora Enterprises, I'm the president. I report directly to the CEO. That is where we make decisions on investments and team members and all that other stuff. We still do report to the Advocate Aurora Board of Directors. So we do follow the financial approval policy of Advocate Aurora, but it is a way to sort of create some separation. But I do sit on the Advocate Aurora executive team, so I have the ability to sort of figure out how to access resources to support what we're up to. And I think that was it. So I went very fast, but I'm looking at my watch and realizing I still did go for a good 20 minutes. So let me stop there. Jonathan, the only question I have is, do you want me to leave any of these slides up? Like I could go back and put this slide up for now, and then tell me if there's questions. Glad to answer them.
Thank you, Scott. Actually, if you can advance it a couple of slides there. Yeah, I think leave that one up. That's a really good one.
My pleasure.
You know, one thing I'd like to start off with asking, and you know, I have some of the benefit of this knowledge because we've been talking about dual transformation for several years now, but can you talk a little bit about the kind of the early days of when you and Advocate were looking at a strategy and coming across dual transformation, and then kind of the process that you went through? Because I know that there were bumps in the road and you've come so far since then. I think it would be helpful for those that are listening and thinking about maybe this could be potentially valuable, you know, for their organizations.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can start there, that'd be great.
Yeah. So this even sort of goes back before our merger. So we officially closed our merger April 1 of 2018. We started merger conversations in earnest in April of 2017. So we sort of went from initial conversation to closed deal in a year, which is pretty fast, actually, if you think about it, given regulatory requirements. And so even back in 2016, 2017, when we were starting these conversations, you know, both of the organizations were we were sitting across the table saying, why are we even in front of each other? And it's because we both, for slightly different reasons, but we both felt that, you know, the need for, you know, massive scale and the underlying disruption we were both facing, again, for slightly different reasons. In Illinois, we have essentially a single payer system called Blue Cross of Illinois. And, you know, in effect, 75% of all of Advocate's revenue came from either Medicare, Medicaid, or Blue Cross. And in Wisconsin, where, although it's not quite the same payer dynamic, you know, Aurora was coming off of, they had signed 15-year long-range contracts with their payers that were, you know, for a long time incredibly lucrative, but they realized those contracts were coming due, and the ability to sustain that kind of revenue growth was not going to happen. So we're both sitting around the table saying, you know what, we've been living the good life for a long time, and we are going to need to change, and we're going to have to change fast. We're going to need to, so we can't just continue to incrementally improve. We need to have more transformational change. So what I was looking for as we started, you know, as the merger was starting to come together was, you know, is there someone out there who has a, you know, how do you transform? What does it mean? What is transformational change? What are strategies around that? And I literally got invited to a presentation by a consultant at one of our hospitals. I had no idea. I was just invited to be there as the chief strategy officer, and it was someone from Insight speaking about this concept of, are you in a position where your business kind of, no matter, every year it just gets harder. Maybe you close your gap in your budget, but every year, you're cutting a little bit deeper, and over time, are you just at a point where you're simply incrementally, cutting expenses and can't quite see how that's ever going to change? And the answer was yeah, and that's how I got introduced to the concept, and read the book and met with Insight and sold our newly created executive team on this idea, and really socialized with them a lot around this concept of dual transformation. I will tell you, we used Insight to help us, and this is not a sales pitch for Insight, but they were really good and really smart. But we never use outside consulting for strategy, other than we'll check in for sounding boards. But so this was a first for both organizations to kind of use someone to help kind of go through the process, who provided some of that thought leadership. So that's kind of how we did it. The biggest challenge was getting our board on board. And we have continued to have to do that because they don't live this every day. And to be honest with you, they see, although we talk about the challenges and they're aware of it, they also see that both organizations were still successful. We both had pretty strong margins. Every year we sort of talk about the challenges, and then we pull the margin out of our hat at the end. And so getting them to be willing to say, we're going to have to divert some resources away from the core and try some new things. That took a number of planning sessions. We ended up, even though we sort of had the strategy done, we ended up going back and spending literally, we ended up, I think, spending 4 months with the board, having meetings every month, even after the strategy was done, before they would approve it. They wanted to go relitigate most of this and make sure that we truly needed to have dual transformation. And even last year, and even this year, we've had to remind them of why dual transformation is going to be mission critical. So it's the board and the learning process there is probably the biggest issue. I hope that gets at, Jonathan, what you were asking.
Absolutely. Perfect. And I wanted to thank you also because you were the one that made the book aware to me. It was the first time I had heard of it. And
I need a royalty. I think I single-handedly put Insight, their book, on the Amazon. I wouldn't say bestseller, but certainly for business books. They had like a weird bump right after we hired them because I made everyone read the book. So I get no royalty. And again, this is not a plug for them. There are other organizations who do this. It's just they kind of innovated, or they kind of invented a lot of the concepts. That's all.
And it's an easy read, so I really recommend everyone.
Yeah, if you're looking, especially during quarantine, if you're looking for an easy read, that's definitely a pretty easy one.
It was fascinating because after you had told me about the book, I probably had a half a dozen conversations within a couple of months of people starting to look at it in different healthcare and non-healthcare organizations to really transform their core business. So another question, you mentioned discouraging some from embarking on dual transformation. Beyond the at-risk population dynamics that Advocate Aurora has, what else would lend for and against the dual transformation model, specifically for health systems?
Yeah, I think so. The first is, let me kind of tell you all the reasons. I go back to if you are not experiencing a scenario where your underlying profitability of the core is not, at least you think there's a reasonable chance that it's permanently eroding. Because if you don't believe that, then I literally would say just don't do this, because again, why would you take resources from your core business? Why would you diversify into things where you might not have, a lot of knowledge, where you might be taking more risk, where you might have to lose some money in the beginning, where you're going to divert resources from the core and get people mad, and you're going to set up this separate thing that maybe looks like it's getting preferential treatment. And those people are then going to be thinking, this is great. We get some autonomy and try to do different things. And then they get, sort of sucked into the bureaucracy of the core. So it's just a painful process. And, your board's going to constantly, be looking at every failure and sort of taking a lot of risk there. So I sort of like, if you don't have that condition where you like, it's like, there's no matter what we do, we're probably over the long term, and again, not the medium, but the long term, or the next 10 years, not going to be able to sustain our profitability in the core. That's the fundamental belief you have to have. And you have to believe, that the reasons are structural and not cyclical. So again, for us, underlying utilization going down in the inpatient, we think is structural. It's not cyclical. Again, notwithstanding COVID. That's one. And if we believe that the landscape of competitors has fundamentally changed. We don't really look at other health systems. I mean, to some extent, we still compete for share with health systems, but our larger concern is the disruption from other kinds of competitors, like a United Optum, who has 20 times the revenue, and their free cash flow, annual free cash flow, is actually 1.5 times our total annual revenue. And they're in our markets in a big way, directly competing with us. And we believe that the technology, mega scale technology platform companies are going to get into our space in some way, shape, or form, whether it's Amazon or Apple or anybody else. And where there's a massive amount of capital from private equity and venture funding smaller, so they're maybe not having the same magnitude of impact, but I call that death by 1,000 cuts. So in Chicago, there's probably 10 different venture or private equity funded primary care or other models that are actively competing for business with us. And so, like, those are the kinds of conditions you need to see present. Again, I presented a similar set of slides, and I won't name the state, and everyone sort of looked at me like I had two heads, because they said, look, you know what, we don't, we're the largest game in town. We've got growth in our population. We don't have payers who are, we're getting, 3 or 4 percentage point base rate increases on our fee for service contracts. Yeah, we got some Medicaid, but our state's actually an okay payer in Medicaid. And, I'm like, well, then don't do this. I actually sort of said, why did you even invite me, to be honest with you? So that's kind of my take on how you got to think about this. If you're gonna embark on it, you just have to have those conditions present.
Great, thank you. There's a kind of significant shift in organizational structure from what you see typically, and it's something that I know is a very important component of dual transformation, and being the recovering attorney that's created businesses and represented them, recognize that. But can you talk not only from the organizational structure of you being the president of this new entity that reports to the CEO, which that component being important. So you've got kind of the leader of the organization, if you will, giving you cover for some of these decisions, but then also the internal detractors, because you're pulling some of the resources from the core, which is a key component to leverage in order to be successful for that transformation B.
Yeah, so let me describe a couple of things very briefly. So the way we oversee strategy overall, so this overall transformation strategy that's on the page is we have an executive team, and it's, it's a lot of people, includes our chief information officer, COO, CFO, et cetera. And that is the group. Our executive team is sort of the ones I say who run the company. And, we meet every week, and we just met yesterday. And of course, we're talking about COVID and our vaccination distribution strategy and our safety journey. We just got did our culture of safety survey results, and talk about all the things you'd see in the middle column and in the left. What we've decided to do, though, is that's what I call that kind of the operating model. And then underneath our chief operating officer, all the detailed clinical and, specific operations in the core. It's kind of, he manages that through a weekly meeting as well. What we decided to do was say, look, when it comes to thinking about transformation and resource allocation, and maybe giving people a chance to take some risk and try some new things, we set up a separate group called our Transformation Oversight Committee. It's a subset of our executive team. There's 7 of us on that, and it's the CEO and myself, and our CFO is there, and our COO, but it's a place where we can sort of talk in a smaller setting, and we have a transformation fund that we then can allocate to encourage across any of these verticals, encourage innovation and experimentation. And so that's kind of how we're trying to manage and set up a little bit of separateness, just even for transformation, to focus on and push the organization to take some risks that they're not inherently designed to do. So that's part one. And then part two, as I said, is we've just created this separate subsidiary, Advocate Aurora Enterprises. And by the way, this is not all that innovative. I mean, there's a bunch of these examples. UPMC, who might even be on this call, not sure, but they have UPMC Enterprises. Providence had Providence Enterprises. They just renamed and rebranded it, but same concept, which is you're accumulating assets oftentimes in a set of businesses that aren't necessarily your core. You want them, you probably want them to not be subjected to the same compliance and regulatory scrutiny as the core. They need to move faster and make decisions. So that's why we set up the separate subsidiary. Again, we technically have a separate board because it's a separate subsidiary, but the fiduciary board is still the Advocate System board. And so, but again, I mentioned we set up a separate capital pool. So our long-range financial plan that our board approves at Advocate Aurora has 2 buckets. One is our core capital, and the other is our, our whole person health, if you will, or Advocate Aurora Enterprises capital. That gets looked at every year, of course, but I sort of know, to a reasonable order of magnitude level of precision, how much capital I have to invest in our whole person health strategy over the next 5 years. And yes, I have to go to our Advocate Aurora board for approval to spend that if it hits a certain threshold, just like anyone would. But knowing that's out there is very helpful for designing a different strategy. So I'll just stop there, Jonathan. I'm not sure I'm getting at what you were raising, but it's sort of maybe another layer of detail.
Yeah, absolutely. There's exactly what I was asking. So I appreciate that. One final question for you, Scott. Has there been any impact on your dual transformation efforts or strategy? Has COVID basically impacted your strategy, and what has that impact been?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. So what I would say is, here's what has not been impacted. And I will say that back in April and May, which seems like a long time ago, this was an open question, which is the board's commitment to this dual transformation strategy. And so, as we were hunkering down and dealing with, for us, what was the first of what's now been, 2 or 3 waves, and we had shut down our elective activity and a lot of our outpatient activity. And we're watching the income statement take a huge blow. And quite frankly, our balance sheet, because of our investment portfolio taking a huge blow. It was a question of like, okay, is this the death blow before we even get started to this dual transformation concept? And we, we spent a bunch of time in April, May, and in August with our board. And in August, we brought forward our, we were originally going to bring our long range financial plan forward, which is, to me, that's where the rubber hits the road, because you can talk strategy conceptually, but if there's no resources to support it, it's not really a strategy. And normally we would have brought that forward in May. And again, we were in the throes of so much uncertainty, we deferred bringing our long range financial plan until August. And in August, we came forward and said, guess what? We're still committed to having a separate capital pool, despite the balance sheet challenges we're facing. We're going to have this separate capital pool and separate team, and we're committed to, the budget to fund this whole person health strategy, and the board signed off on that. So that's one thing. Again, I didn't know if that was how it was going to play out. I sort of suspected that, but so what has not changed is the commitment to the strategy. So that's great. What has changed within the strategy, some of our, it's both an incubation and an acquisition strategy, although it's more heavily weighted towards acquisition. Because when you're a $13 billion company, if all you do is bootstrap startups from within, it's going to take 50 years to make a material dent in our income statement. And the goal is not just, is of course to help people live well, but we're also dealing with that profitability curve. And our job is to generate ultimately an accretive set of revenue. And so if we're building it all from scratch from within, that's going to take, 50 or 100 years. So we are weighted towards acquisition. What we found is what's changed is our acquisition opportunities have accelerated because companies have had to face some real challenges. And a bunch of the companies that we're looking at in consumer health have, taken some hits from COVID. And so their revenue growth has slowed a little bit. So it's giving us some interesting opportunities. On the other hand, some of our internally incubated things are just sort of they've been on pause. They've sort of restarted, but we probably lost 4 months of activity where things were just shut down. And again, the other challenge is our core is completely, inundated dealing with COVID. And so accessing the capabilities of the core is a lot harder when they're sort of, and you understand you're dealing with a pandemic. The last thing I want to do when we're trying to deal with, how are we going to distribute a vaccine and implement that? Or how are we dealing with having 800 people out of work because they either have COVID or had a COVID exposure and on quarantine, and they're just trying to balance staffing. And here I am calling saying, hey, can you help me with this new business thing that's not going to generate revenue for 2 years? So a lot of that stuff, I think, slowed down. But again, I would just say the commitment to the strategy, rock solid, the resources, we've had to take slight hits in the amount of resources that we have available, just like the core has, but we still have what I believe to be a very adequate funnel of capital and operating resources to get the job done. And some things are moving a little bit faster. And a few things, of course, are a little bit slower.
Appreciate it, Scott. Thank you very much. Earlier you had mentioned a few other health systems like UPMC and Providence, and we had Aaron from Providence on one of our programs, and interesting model similar to what you were talking about with acquisition. Just in my backyard in Madison was a startup company, Blue Tree Network, that they had acquired, and it's consulting firm largely, but it looks a lot different because you've got a large provider organization that's much more than just a provider that is doing these sort of acquisitions and activities that branching out from their core A, if you will,
I know Aaron pretty well. I speak to him pretty frequently. And Wasif is the person who runs what was called Providence Enterprises. So yeah, so we talk a lot because they're a couple years ahead of us in terms of deploying capital, and we're aiming at slightly different sectors. I mean, we're much more about consumer health, and they're really more about IT and rev cycle and other things that are kind of supporting the health system clients. Whereas, and I think folks on this call will appreciate this. Like, I don't really like businesses that are dependent on selling into health systems, at least if that's their primary channel of revenue. That scares me because, there's nothing more convoluted and painful than the sales cycle into a health system, other than maybe the government. But, and I can say that being a health system person, like the slow no will, another way of saying is our sales cycle is longer than most startups Series Seed, Series A, and Series B fundraising. So it's very painful. So I appreciate what Aaron and Wasif are doing at Providence. And the way they structured it, to me, is sort of a benchmark for us. We're angling at a different piece of the revenue pie. That's all.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do an audible here, since we've gone over a little bit, which is great. Instead of going into breakout rooms, since we only have about 5 minutes left, want to ask one more question from one of our attendees. Charles asks, when the innovation arm is both using shared services and also free to bypass some of the procurement procedures, there has to be some great tension at times. How do you resolve that tension?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I would say is the magic and secret sauce to all this is actually, let me see if I have the slide. If I can move it, I will. Oop, hold on. It's this slide. So the magic is the CEO. So basically, he has publicly, at least with the right audiences within our management team, said, I want Advocate Aurora Enterprises, although it's a wholly owned subsidiary, and therefore legally owned by Advocate Aurora, I want it to be exempt from everything in the core as a default point of view. Start from there. And then what he said was, I understand that's not possible, because being a wholly owned subsidiary means that by definition, if I'm running Advocate Aurora Enterprises and, doing a bunch of fraudulent criminal activities or even non-criminal activities that are ultimately, and going out and borrowing money and doing all kinds of other things, that's going to impact Advocate Aurora Health, the parent organization. So you can't be completely exempt from everything. But what he said is, I want to start with, let's exempt it from as many things as humanly possible. And then only those things that are absolutely necessary to protect, the big issues like our tax exempt status in the core, in our care delivery and things of that nature. And because he said that, everyone, and quite frankly, most everyone gets the strategy. We've been socializing this for over 2 years now, and they understand. So the way you get over this is, one, you've got to have a CEO willing to put that out there and and his job is take the heat. And, and two is you got to socialize the heck out of the strategy. And quite frankly, the other thing we do is we involve people from the core in the strategy. So, the capabilities link that I described requires us working with the core, and people in the core, at least in our organization, most, not all, but most, love doing something different and contributing and being asked to contribute their innovative ideas. And so we've got over the last couple of years, have built a pretty decent culture of innovation and testing things that makes people excited. Again, there are certainly people who I would say get kind of frustrated because they feel like we're getting special treatment in Advocate Aurora Enterprises, but I don't broadcast that all that loudly. But the CEO has kind of set the tone, and that's kind of how it works. I don't know if that's exactly answering the question, but that's kind of how I would describe how the culture is sort of operating, at least at this moment.
Scott, I really appreciate the presentation, appreciate the Q&A. A lot of valuable information here, a lot of valuable insight into how your organization is viewing innovation and looking at transformation. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Just one announcement. Chime Innovation is launching an emerging ventures program. If you're a hospital leader working with any digital health startups, we want to hear from you. Whether you've incubated a new venture, co-created with an outside partner, invested directly into that venture, or are an early adopter, please message me directly, jfritz@chimecentral.org. I'd also like to thank, once again, ClearSense and Nordic for being our seasoned supporters for Innovation Beyond the Edge, and to CITI and Bill Carter, thank you very, very much for supporting today's session. Really appreciate it. Scott, again, thank you. It's always a pleasure. To everyone, my apologies for not having the breakout room sessions today. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. Have a wonderful day and be well.